Let's go over the games we played today. So as you guys know, I'm playing in the Washington class. It's this weekend. There's 6 rounds. On Friday, I played 2 games. Saturday, I played 2 games, and I'll play 1 game tomorrow, actually. Today, I played 2 games. The first game lasted 4.5 hours. The second game lasted 6.5 hours. Going into round 3, I was 0.5 out of 2. I was playing Owen Zhu. This guy is a student at the chess company I teach for. So I have to beat him because otherwise, you know, I was playing white. I started with e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. Knight f6, knight c3, e5, so that's Sveshnikov, knight db5, d6, bishop g5, a6, knight a3, b5, knight d5, bishop e7, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, c4. This is all completely theory so far, so we're both playing theory. Here, I actually thought for a while, I debated whether to play c3 or c4 because I've played c4 in the past and I get very annoyed by the knight hopping into d5. I played c4. This is all theory. b5, knight c2. This is all theory so far. a5. And at this point, I was basically out of theory. I knew some plans for white. I knew h4 was a move here, but I didn't really understand it, so I didn't want to play it. I was a little worried about going into that when I hadn't really studied games with that line, so I didn't want to do that, even though I knew that h4 was a move here. I started with b3. He played bishop g5, which this is actually still theory for him. I played bishop e2, so I know this bishop is going to be bad because I've got all the pawns on light squares, so I want to trade this off. I want to get it to g5 and trade it off. The other plan was to play g3, h4, bishop h6, and trade off the bishop like this. But I decided to play bishop e2, try to get my bishop to g5, and go for that trade. Black castle, I played bishop g5, and here my opponent played knight e7. I'm not worried about him taking. If he takes, though, it's very important to note that you should certainly take back with the queen, because if you take with the pawn, then you fill in this hole. Right now, the d5 square is a massive hole in black's position. If you take with a pawn, then you just solve all of black's problems, because black does not have to worry about the d6 pawn being weak anymore. Black does not have to worry about a piece being in d5 anymore. So it's an important thing to note. If this capture ever happens, you must take back with the queen. I calculated a few things here. I calculated knight e3. I didn't like that, though, because I didn't want him to trade this bishop for this knight, and then he would be able to trade his knight on d5, and I didn't like that. Right away, taking with the queen would hang the bishop. But just as a positional awareness, you really do not want to have to take with a pawn here. So he actually is threatening to take because of exactly what you said. The bishop would be hanging. You have to do something about that. Well, he actually not, because if he takes, you can actually throw in bishop takes c8. Sorry. I thought of a few different things here. I played bishop takes c8 because that was my plan, right? I wanted to trade off my bad light squared bishop. If he takes, I take with the queen. I'm good. I'm going to pressure this d6 pawn on this half open d file, and I think I'm going to have a very good position. I can castle. This knight can get around to f3 or d3, maybe coming to f5 later, so it should be good. He took with the rook, and now I castle. Now he played rook c5, so now he actually is threatening to take this knight, but I thought rook c5 was slightly inaccurate because first I can take his knight. He has to take back. He actually didn't think for a long time here. He took back with the queen very quickly. I don't know exactly where, but I know at this point that black has gone wrong somewhere. Why? Because I can play a3. And what does black do with their queenside pawns? They're going to be weak no matter what black does. If they take, I take with the knight, my knight gets to b5. You have this isolated a pawn that's going to be a lot of pressure, and my knight blocks the b file. You can still never push d5. That pawn is backwards. So I was creating all of these weaknesses. I just have a fantastic position at this point, right? If you don't take, if you like try to defend, the pawn is still isolated. I'm going to play with the open a file, and I just get a lot of pressure. So my opponent was already starting to go wrong here. He started by taking. I took, my opponent played f5. The idea behind this move is that he wants to remove the e4 pawn so that he can play d5 and try to just break up my pawns and get rid of some of his weaknesses. I thought if I was playing f3 here, the idea behind f3 is that if he takes that, I still get a pawn on e4, but I did not want to do this because I felt like I could get attacked on these dark squares. My dark squares were just too weak here. You know, he gets his bishop in, his queen in, rook comes over here. I didn't like that. That looks pretty scary. And also by playing f3, I cut my pieces off from defending my king. I can't play this move. I thought about taking. The move I ended up going with was knight b5. I'm attacking this. I'm threatening to take this pawn. I hang my e pawn, but there was not really a lot I could do anyway. He was going to be taking. I didn't want to take because it just doesn't make any sense. He played f takes e4. I was very happy to see this because the line that I saw, I first took this d pawn. Here he actually traded queens, which I didn't think was good. It's even material right now, but you can already tell that white has a good advantage here, right? These pawns are weak. This is a very solid setup with the knight and pawns. White's king is safer. This is just a better position for white, basically in every way. My opponent did trade queens, which I was a little surprised by, because now I regain this pawn and I'm going to be up a pawn. All the way back here, before I played knight b5, I saw this line where I played knight b5, he takes, I take with the queen. You don't want to take with the knight because of rook to e8, so I take with the queen. He takes, and I was worried about e3. E3, it might be a move that you look at briefly because your pawn is hanging and you can't really defend it. This obviously doesn't work. The rook will be kicked away eventually, so that's not going to work. It's a move if you're just trying to save your pawn, but then you realize, oh, it's not just the pawn, it's also a horsey fork. So I can't do anything about my pawn. I'm just going to lose my pawn because I have to move one of these pieces. But I kept looking at e3. I saw e3, he allows the horsey fork. First he takes. I can't take this because if I take with the knight, then it's just even material again. I can't take with the rook because he pins my rook. Once again, it would be even material. It would not be very good. So I have to play king h1. Then he drops the bishop back, takes. And even though I get this pawn, I thought this was very solid for black. This pawn on f2, this has potential to be very dangerous. I thought this is what he should have gone for. And the engine actually agrees. The engine says this is the best line because I don't know what I would have done against this. Like, white's up in exchange, but it's very tricky for white. I thought he should have gone for this. But he didn't go for this. He instead played bishop d8. He's defending this a pawn. And I just slowly grinded down the position. Now I'm up a pawn. These pawns are still very weak, so I know at this point the position is winning. I really want to trade my knight for this bishop because it's hard for me to attack this pawn with my knight. And his bishop defends this pawn. So if I can trade my knight for the bishop, the rook endgame should be basically trivial. I'm up a pawn. His pawns are very weak. That was my plan the next 10 to 20 moves. That was what I was doing. I took the pawn. Knight takes e4. Rook c6. Rook fd1. He played bishop c7. I played rook d3. Here, I want to play g3 to prevent rook f4 so that he can't attack my knight. But g3 allows rook f3, which is a bigger threat than rook f4. So I can't play g3 right now. So I played rook d3. I'm defending this pawn, defending the f3 square, also preparing to double up. Now he played rook f4. This is actually really annoying. Here, if he doesn't play rook f4, then the position becomes very, very easy to win because I play g3, I stop rook f4, and then I play king g2. I've gotten rid of my back rank weakness. My pawns are all on dark squares, countering his bishop. My king is never going to get back rank. It's closer to the center. It's just a fantastic position. I have absolutely no problems. But he did play rook f4. This kind of sucks because if I move the knight, he has e5. The bishop could pin the knight. This looked not super great. If I go here, he has this move now. I did not want to do this. It did not look clean to me, right? I want to get the cleanest conversion possible here. Moving the knight is not something you can do. Well, what about defending the knight? Well, if you play rook here, your rook no longer guards a4. It introduces possibilities where he can play a4, sack his a pawn to pick up the c pawn. And now this pawn is isolated and white's advantage has definitely gone down a lot here. I didn't want to move the knight. I didn't want to defend. I was thinking about all of these things before I had even played rook d3. I ended up just playing f3, and yes, it does weaken my dark squares, but it doesn't really matter because I can just play king f1. This knight is cemented here forever. It's in an outpost, so he can never do anything. If he ever gets his kingside pawns rolling to try to break up my pawns, I can just play h3, shut down any of those ideas, and I mean, I should be good to go. So I played f3 here. He played h6, which I thought was pretty slow. Now I played knight c3. Once again, my plan here is to trade my knight for his bishop so that I can win these pawns much more easily. He is trying to avoid allowing that trade. He played rook f7. I doubled up. And then he played rook f8. Here he actually almost played rook f4. He picked up his rook, put it on the f4 square, and then he realized it was a mistake because he brought it back. He was still holding on to it, and then he eventually played rook f8. He has to move the rook because of touch move. But this would obviously be a huge mistake because it gets the fork. You're not actually losing any material, but it allows me to trade my knight for his bishop, which, like I said, if I can do that, then this rook end game should just be gravy. He played rook f8, rook f7, rook d7, bishop b6 check. I just played king f1. He played rook f7. I do not want to trade rooks here because if I trade both of the rooks, then the minor piece endgame becomes a little unclear. It's definitely still winning, but it would be much harder to win. So I did not want to trade rooks. However, I was open to the idea. If for whatever reason I couldn't make any progress with my plan of trying to trade this knight for this bishop, I would not be super opposed to trading rooks and trying to win the minor piece endgame. For now, I did not want to play rook, so I played rook 7 d5. He played rook e6. I played knight e4, bishop c7, rook 1 d3, rook f e7. He played rook c6, and I played knight c3, so I'm threatening the fork, so he has to do something about it. He played king f7. Now this does not work because he pins my knight and I cannot take the bishop. I played king d2, activating my king, and also now I am once again threatening this because rook d7 would not pin the rook anymore. I think he made his final blunder of the game here. Here my opponent, I think, made his final, like, really big blunder of the game, which was rook e to e6, because this allows the move. He was obviously trying to avoid this fork. I don't know if this is actually a mistake or if it just, like, everything finally crumbled, because we know that black's position is already losing. Like, all the way back here after bishop d8, we already know black is losing. So I think maybe none of these moves from black were actually blunders, but it just finally all came crumbling down, which, if your opponent is playing well, will eventually happen when you have a losing position. So I played rook d7 check. The king can't come here because you get forked, and you have to protect your g7 pawn. There's no reason why you would ever go back. So my opponent played king g6. This allows knight d5, and the bishop is trapped. Well, the bishop has one square, which is d6. In fact, you can't even defend the bishop again. So bishop d6 is actually forced. Any other move would just straight up lose the bishop. So you have to play bishop d6, but unfortunately this loses the a pawn. So now I'm going to be up 2 pawns. After my opponent played rook e6, and I saw like this whole sequence with rook d7, knight e5, I actually saw something in the end, which ended up happening. I was like, okay, if he tries to play e5 and tries to like open up the position and get some checks with his rooks, I actually have a very cute move, which this ended up happening. He did play e5. Here, I played rook takes d6. Because if he takes with this rook, then I get this fork. And if he takes with the other rook, then I get this fork. So it's a very cute move. I played this because I'm up 2 pawns. I just want to simplify at this point. He threw in a check. It didn't really do much. He took, I gave the fork. My opponent, he didn't resign here, which is respectable. I started with rook d5. He can't take this. Obviously, he wins a pawn, but the king and pawn endgame is losing. So my opponent obviously didn't take that. I dropped back to my second rank, protecting my second rank, looking to get behind these pawns and start pushing them. My opponent played h5. I played king f4 to prevent g5. King f6 to try to play g5 again, and I played h4 to stop g5 once again. Rook a1. I played rook b2, getting my rook behind this pawn. Rook h1. G3, rook f1 check. I played king e2. My king's going to have to come over here eventually, which is one of the reasons why I played g3 here, not king g3. Because if I play king g3, then he just plays rook c1. I can't really do anything. I have to get my king over here to help the advancement of these pawns. Anyway, rook f1 check, king e3. Here he played g5, which it's a very easy conversion here after rook f2 check. Obviously, the king and pawn endgame is very easily winning. I actually didn't see this though. The reason was because I only had 2 minutes left on my clock. I played b4 instead. G takes h4. Here's when I saw rook f2 check, and I checked. I made sure. I'm like, okay, rook f2 check, takes. Yeah, that's still winning because I've got 2 connected pass pawns. I played rook f2, and the conversion was quite easy after this. My opponent played it out until checkmate. And we got the nice pawn mate, b6, checkmate. So we got the win. Yes! First win of the tournament. We're 1.5 out of 3 after round 3. Very good game to Owen Zoo. We get some nice rating points from that. I was going into round 4 with 1.5 out of 3. And I was playing a women's candidate master. And so these students becomes still these students.